I'm curious why both research projects decided to just focus on 1 year when the regular program is 3 or 4 years. Was that just a practicality?
So it is a practicality. So because when we embarked on this study, it was so out of the box, new. There was really no data to lead us. And so Greg was not overstating the case when he said we just kind of took a shotgun approach to it. And I really think of it as almost being hypothesis generating. So now we know enough to know what we don't know to actually start to ask the questions. And so the reason we took that first year was just to see what was there to help us kind of move along and start down the gate. Another practical issue is just funding. This funding, at least in my lab, has been supported by very generous donations. We haven't had like a major 5 or 10 year grant that gave us a long-term stability, or we could say we're going to study it for 1 to 4 to 5 years. And part of that is because there were, again, it leads to the first problem. There were no data to help us start to make those questions. So it's really been just that they're very, very early days. We do, and this is, I don't want to tease or tempt, we do have 2-year data on a subset of kids who were kind enough to come back again. And without my study coordinator, Catherine, here, I think they number probably 12 to 15 at this point. They're not data that we've really unpacked fully yet, but we did try to chase kids down for a little bit longer, and we hope to start to understand what more of the longer term implications are as well as we move forward.
Thank you.
Greg, if you want to add to that.
We're following really a similar course. There are certain things that, should theoretically be changing quickly. But we also have a few students, fewer than it sounds like in Vancouver, that we will be imaging and testing that'll be in the second year of the program this year. And I think we just need to sort of look and see, where we think the hot spots are. As Laura mentioned, we're really searching, right now we're searching for the biggest effects to help us refine our tools and refine our hypotheses. Well, then we can go back, and the ultimate goal really is the old single subject design, where you can say, okay, I can do this assessment on your child, and whether it's you can predict that the Arrowsmith program is really going to be beneficial overall or in certain areas, or whether we can, based on the baseline, say that there'll be proportional improvements, or that a program with as much flexibility as Arrowsmith has, that the design should be directed in a certain way.
I could just jump in, because Greg said something that I wanted to mention. And those of you who know the Arrowsmith program already know this. It makes a bit of a research nightmare for us, and that is that the programs are all so highly individualized, which I believe is absolutely the perfect way to do it. But it means that we're studying, we're pretending like kids are getting the same intervention, and they're really actually not, because they're all getting a highly individualized intervention. And so it brings us back again to, now that we know a little bit more, trying to understand how to pull that out and do these kind of single subject analyses, or you could conceive of a larger study where we had just a massive amount of data, and we could perhaps apply some machine learning to it to look at all those little individual responses within each individual child, with their age, their gender, there's a number of different things, the specifics of their program, and start to unpack kind of how all of that's interacting. So it's actually a massively complicated problem.
If there was a universal solution, we would have found it.
So I've actually done some of the Arrowsmith exercises on a part-time basis. My son and I did. And the one thing that I really noticed is, and he was 14, going on 15 at the time, is that enthusiasm plays quite a role in terms of success. So my pre and post assessment improvements were a lot higher than his. And, he wasn't very enthusiastic at all. I mean, it was a 2-hour drive to get to the place. We were there for almost 2 hours doing exercises. And I'm just curious, is that something you're able to study? Is that something that you've considered in terms of neuroplasticity effectiveness?
So another colleague who couldn't be here, Kim Schonert-Reichel, is actually collecting quite a bit of data right now on even in greater detail social emotional outcomes. And so I think that may speak a little bit more. I mean, we certainly know that if you're motivated, yes, you're going to be more engaged. but it's not something that we've been measuring per se.
I know these studies were focused on younger age groups, and the Aerosmith program seems to be primarily targeted at children and young adults. Do you have any maybe insights that you can glean from the studies that you guys conducted that would indicate implications for adults? Anything that you hypothesize might be extensible just based on your research?
So I don't have any reason to believe that you wouldn't see similar effects in adults. I'm saying that not based on any data that we have, but just the understanding that, while developing brains are highly, highly neuroplastic, adult brains aren't so bad. We're a little slower, but there's no particular age or developmental cap on your capacity to change your brain. And so I would think that you should see similar types of effects if were you to apply the program in adults. It's not something that we've done. It's something that we've played with as an idea. There is an adult program in Vancouver, but we, quite frankly, have had our hands full with what we've done to date. And it'd be a really neat study if someone's interested in embarking upon that to take a look.
Hi, thank you very much. I had two questions. One is, what are the types of drugs that hamper neuroplasticity? And the other question is, could you explain a little bit more about whether there are differences relating to diagnoses of the BREM group versus the groups that were studied by the University of British Columbia?
I can just speak to the drugs. There's some what are called NMDA agonists that so people are sometimes given, typically for adult neurologic conditions that can obstruct neuroplasticity. I don't think any of our children were actually taking anything, but it's just standard exclusion criteria for our work. And I don't, do you want to speak, Greg, to the exclusion differences between
Sure, I
Wested and
can.
yours?
Well, also I can, basically I teach about these drugs to medical students. And, basically the drugs in the anticonvulsant class and the anxiolytic class, even some antidepressants, if the dosages are high, all inhibit the, sort of neurobiological basis for the plasticity that we think is essential for encoding new learning. So, so this is definitely a problem. And at BREM, we saw, our kids are just on a pharmacopoeia. A depressed student probably is getting too many drugs, but it's not uncommon to get an antidepressant, sort of the classic, sort of serotonin reuptake inhibitor, but maybe also supplemented by a second-generation antipsychotic drug, which has a really mixed pharmacological background. And so that means, basically, neurobiologically, it's another nightmare. Yeah. But in terms of diversity of the population, we haven't really factored that at all because everyone is an N of one. It's really an issue. I think less so with the Toronto students that we've looked at, but we haven't actually completely incorporated, even obtained all the demographic information that we need to know. And this is part of, what we'd like to do is we'd like to actually answer some questions before the end of our lives. But in terms of getting a sample size that's sufficient to focus in on any of these sub-issues, it's going to be tough unless we can really enhance the recruitment. And one of the things you have to say about the Vancouver group is that they have done a good job of, basically extending their sampling net, because that's really the idea, is to get lots of students and to be able to overcome all the variability that we're seeing.
That's really interesting about the drugs, because I don't believe our kids are taking. We didn't exclude anyone for taking.
Well,
those
no,
types of
that
drugs,
would be
so maybe this
great
is
if so.
a cultural demographic issue.
Yeah, that's
how we
also-
save money in Canada.
Yeah.
Thank you for tonight's presentation. And I've worked with the Aerosmith program for a long time, but before that, I also worked in special education for a long time, and I worked at in various other programs that I used. And I'm curious, and maybe this is more for Dr. Weber. Are there other programs like Wharton Gillingham or other things that have gone through this sort of level of data analysis and research that it's always surprised me, the reluctance of other psychologists doing assessments to refer to Aerosmith, but will refer to other programs that I think don't have this level of rigor in terms of research. You can't answer for all psychologists.
I mean, I can tell you that Orton Gillingham does. Perhaps not at the neuroimaging level, but definitely at the behavioral level. There's a considerable wealth of research on that program. So typically, a responsible psychologist, an ethical or psychologist, would be familiar with the evidence that exists for the programs that they're recommending. And so at least the psychologist I train. But we're working on it for the Aerosmith program as well.
I was just going to add, so why is that? Because the Orton Gillingham's been around longer? Why is?
I couldn't answer that question for anyone else. I would say it's a much simpler program. It has it has a much narrower target, so it's frankly easier to research. And then, I couldn't say why I'm interested in researching this program, so here we are, but I couldn't speak for anyone else.
Okay.
Could you tell us why the right-handed issue with the MRI, I couldn't get that, and then does that mean also you've excluded maybe a profound point? Maybe the left-handed people are different. I mean, how would we know?
Yes, so maybe they are different, and we could embark upon a study of just the left-handed individuals. So when we do MRI imaging, often we exclude left-handed people because when we average the brain, we need to be sure that all the brain functions are lateralized to the same side. And so for example, in right-handed people, all of us, our dominant cortex for movement is the left side, and the dominant cortex for language is the left side. So that's right-handed people. Left-handed people, most of them, that's also true. There's this small proportion, 10, maybe 20%. They're what we call reverse brain, and they actually are flipped. So language is now on the right side of the brain instead of the left side of the brain. So if you then go through and you start averaging them together into a group data set, it mixes it all up and it just becomes a big mess and doesn't quite work. So if you look at the neuroimaging literature, oh boy, I would say 95% of it is on right-handed people. It is a problem in the literature though, because there might be something really interesting and important about those left-handed individuals that we just don't yet understand. But it's a difficulty that we haven't quite solved as an imaging community at this point.
Maybe this is going to sound kind of wacky, but is there a way to have the children's, outside of your study, have the children's myelination measured before they go into the program to see if they would be responders? And is it difficult? Is it something that you could just go to your doctor and do?
So unfortunately at this point, it's actually, I mean, I don't think it's, Ronan and I don't think it's difficult, but there are not many places in the world that do it, and it is indeed a research, not a diagnostic scan. I would caution just that we're not sure that it is indeed a biomarker, but that's an active hypothesis we have right now that we're pursuing to try to find out. So the idea would be that, just an extrapolation might be that yes, indeed, this predicts that you'll have a good response, and maybe this is something that then can become a diagnostic, and that's where diagnostics, tests come from, is this kind of work. We're not quite there. From my other biomarker work, my bet is that we're not going to get that lucky. It's not going to be quite that simple, but it does seem to be that there's something about this connectivity and then on top of it, the integrity of those connections that seems to be quite important. But we don't quite know yet. It's still a little early. Yeah. But if you need your myelin mapped, you're going to have to come see us in Vancouver. You can go to Ohio State or Seoul, Korea. Those are your shots right now.
My question was that the results from the learning difficulty students, is there a comparable subset for students that were in a control group not taking Aerosmith with learning difficulties? And how do the improvements match up?
Sorry, are you referring to the behavioral measures? Or
Yes.
We don't have a control group that's sufficient enough yet to do that comparison for ours. We need another couple years, probably.
Same for the cognitive?
Yes, all of the UBC results, we do not have a control group that's big enough yet.
So we had a control group at baseline. I mean, we are not comfortable with the size. It was like 13. So, you know, we could show you that there were differences. And again, what did we see? We saw differences kind of across the board. Again, it's not that diagnostic. You know, I'm not sure whether in the end it'll be important to have a control group, since what we're really doing is trying to make longitudinal measures and looking for improvement. But we will continue. In fact, that I think for me is a big goal, to actually understand our control populations better.
I think a big goal for us would be to gather control groups of students who are participating in sort of more traditional special education programs.
Right.
So that we can
too.
actually compare that directly to the outcomes that we see in our Erasmus students. So that would probably be the biggest control group needed, or the most important control group needed
Yeah, I
in
mean,
the
I
future.
guess part of the question is, you know, how much variance is there in a control group, right? I mean, basically, if it turns out that we can really say, okay, you know, your typical student, you know, say your typical B student is going to look like this. Well, then, of course, we're allowed to ask the question, is Aerosmith moving their brains like a control, or is it actually, you know, sort of changing the architecture such that they perform like a control, but they do it in a different way? And this is actually part and parcel right now of the aging literature, where the idea is not that you end up going back like you're young, but in fact you've reorganized the way you think, if you will, such that you're able to continue to perform at what would be a young level.
I'm curious, just from your experience, if you found that any activities correlate well with the Aerosmith program for kids' improvement, whether that's meditation, continued academic learning, physical movement, if any of them seem to work kind of hand in hand for that improvement.
Well, I would say in terms of dosage, so the amount of time they're spending, amount of intervention they're receiving, and the amount of time, there's not a lot out there currently in the market that compares, which is one reason we might expect to see different results than maybe your traditional cognitive intervention.
We haven't looked specifically at any of those adjunct interventions. So exercise would be the one I'd be most interested in, frankly.
Yeah.
But there is also mindfulness seems to have these amazing effects. Musical training is another one. I mean, there's a number of them that we just haven't been able to go there yet. It is impressive, I always think, when I go to the school and I look at what they're doing, that a lot of that is incorporated in to the days of these children in ways that, you know, having 2 kids in the Vancouver school system that my kids don't seem to be getting. And so there may be layers of that in here, but we just haven't purposefully unpacked them.